The year was 1887, and the wind coming off Lake Michigan carried more than just a chill. It carried the scent of change. In a narrow brick building tucked deep in Chicago's South Side, Naomi Bell pressed her fingers to the yellowed paper, the words upon it echoing louder in her heart than the city's roar outside. "Dear Miss Bell," it read, "I seek a partner not of station or appearance, but of spirit, someone to build a life beside me on my Wyoming homestead. If this reaches you with hope, write me in return. Sincerely, Matthew Chandler." Naomi wasn't one for dreams. Life hadn't offered her many. Born to a washerwoman and raised among the soot-choked alleys, she had known hunger too long and laughter too little. Yet something in that letter stirred her, a voice steady and kind, from a place wide open and untouched by the judgment she wore like a second skin. The ad had been plain, tucked in the back of a newspaper discarded near the boarding house kitchen. Widowed rancher seeks wife for companionship and frontier partnership. Practicality over beauty. Dignity over daintiness. It wasn't romantic, not in the way of dime novels or whispered stories, but Naomi hadn't lived the kind of life that lent itself to courtship. She worked as a seamstress by day, mending clothes for folks who wouldn't meet her gaze, and scrubbed floors by candlelight just to keep her place at Miss Adeline's house for colored working women. But a letter? That was something different. She wrote back with careful words and firm lines, signing only her name, Naomi Bell, age 29, of sound mind and stronger hands. She told him about her work, her church, and how she'd once nursed a dying widow through the yellow fever without flinching. She didn't hide her skin, her past, or her pride. She didn't apologize. Weeks passed, then came a reply, folded crisp with a lock of pressed sage inside. "Miss Bell, I admire your honesty. If you come, I will meet you at the station in Casper. I have built a cabin with room for 2 and keep 20 head of cattle. There's no parlor or piano, but there is peace. I hope you will find that enough." It wasn't a poem, but it felt like a promise. Naomi packed her few belongings, her father's Bible, a thimble from her mother, and a blue Sunday dress she hadn't worn since the revival meeting of '84. She wrapped them in muslin and tied the bundle tight, her heart steadier than it had been in years. At the station, no one said goodbye. Miss Adeline offered a nod, and the porter helped her aboard without a word. Naomi found a seat by the window, her ticket tucked into her glove, and her future riding on iron tracks bound west. She watched the skyline fade, the buildings giving way to endless plains. With each passing hour, she let go of the soot, the whispers, the ache of being overlooked. Out there in Wyoming, maybe she'd be more than a colored girl with rough hands. Maybe she'd be a wife. Maybe she'd be wanted. But when the train rolled into Casper 3 days later, the platform was empty. Naomi Bell stood alone on that wind-bit platform, her boots stiff from travel and her heart even stiffer. She clutched her parcel close, eyes scanning the sparse figures moving through the station like tumbleweeds. But no one came forward with her name. No man held a placard. No smile broke through the crowd. The letter in her coat pocket rustled like an old ghost. "I will meet you at the station in Casper." That's what he'd promised. But the platform emptied. The train hissed once, then creaked its way down the line, leaving behind only dust and silence. Naomi waited. 5 minutes. Then 10. She didn't panic. Not yet. Ranchers ran late, didn't they? Could be his wagon threw a wheel, or a steer kicked loose. She had patience. That much the city had taught her well. So she waited another 20. Then an hour. The station master passed by with a broom and paused just long enough to glance at her bundle. "You from Chicago?" he asked, not unkindly. She nodded once. He sniffed. "Ain't many like you come through alone. You got someone coming." Naomi swallowed. "I meant to meet a Mr. Chandler. Matthew Chandler." The name didn't register. The man's face changed, though, just slightly, like the flick of a curtain. "Well, can't say I've seen him today. Might be he got held up. You best come inside. Wind's picking up." She thanked him, stepped inside the drafty station house, and took a seat on a bench beneath a faded timetable. Hours passed. The coal stove hissed and clinked. Travelers came and went, but not Matthew Chandler. By sundown, it was clear He wasn't coming. Naomi stepped back outside, the sky painted gold and violet behind the ridges. She had little money left, barely enough for a room or return fare. The streets of Casper weren't cruel like Chicago, but they weren't kind either. Her presence turned heads, drew stares she knew too well. She wandered past a saloon where laughter spilled like whiskey onto the street, past a general store shuddering for the night, past horses hitched beside a chapel whose bell rang out against the dusk. She walked until her legs trembled beneath her and the wind grew mean. The only place left open was a boarding house, plain, whitewashed, and run by a widow named Mrs. Finch who smelled of soap and lemon oil. Naomi knocked, quiet and sure. "I ain't got much," she said, "but I can sew, and I'll work for my keep." Mrs. Finch eyed her, long and hard. Then she stepped aside. "One night. We'll talk tomorrow." That night, Naomi lay awake on a cot no wider than her shoulders, staring up at a cracked ceiling. She didn't cry. There'd been too many years for that. But she did pray. Not for Matthew Chandler, wherever he'd gone. Not even for a second chance. Just for strength. The next morning, Naomi stitched curtains in the boarding house parlor. Her stitches were tight, even. By the afternoon, 2 women asked for dresses, and by sundown, she had a spool of thread in her apron and coin in her palm. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She didn't know it yet, but just across town, in a dimly lit saloon, a man sat nursing a bottle and staring at a letter of his own. A man with eyes like old stone, a wrench too big for one's soul, and a mistake he hadn't the courage to fix. That man was Matthew Chandler. The Silverbuck Saloon sat at the edge of Casper, its roof slumped like an old man's shoulders, and the front porch worn smooth by boot heels and bad choices. Inside, the air hung heavy with pipe smoke, the scent of stale whiskey, and stories no one dared say twice. At a back table, where the light didn't reach and the noise dimmed, Matthew Chandler sat slouched over a half-empty bottle, a letter clutched in his work-worn hands. The edges were creased near to splitting, and the ink had faded some from sweat and guilt. But the words, her words, remained steady. "My name is Naomi Bell. I sew steady, I read scripture, and I don't spook easy." He read that line over and over, like a prayer. He hadn't meant to stay away. Truth be told, he'd ridden out that morning, just like he'd promised. Had the wagon hitched and the coat sheared of dust. But as the station came into view, something in his chest twisted up, real tight. Fear, maybe. Or shame. It was a feeling he hadn't known since burying his wife 3 winters back. Helen had been kind, sure. Gentle, even. But she'd never known the land like he did. Never wanted the wind in her hair or calluses on her hands. And when she'd passed, pneumonia took her fast and cruel. He told himself love wasn't for the likes of him anymore. Just land and cattle. That was safer. But then came Naomi's letters. Strong, sure, and without flattery. She didn't promise devotion. She didn't beg. She just was. And that scared him worse than loneliness ever had. So instead of meeting her train, he rode the long way back home. Told himself he'd write a letter of apology and mail it quick. But he hadn't. And now, 3 days later, she was likely gone. Or worse, still waiting. He took a long pull from the bottle, slammed it down, and pushed away from the table. His boots hit the floor like thunder. "Fool," he muttered to himself. He didn't get far. A voice stopped him cold. "You, Chandler." Matthew turned, eyes narrowing. The barkeep, a heavy-set man with a crooked nose and soft hands, nodded toward the door. "Got a woman of skin after you. Said she came to town for a Mr. Matthew Chandler. Said you owed her some words." Matthew's stomach turned. "Where is she?" The barkeep shrugged. "Stitching curtains over at Finch's house. Got a mouth like a schoolmarm and eyes that could knock a man to his knees." Matthew grabbed his hat, left a coin on the counter, and stepped out into the dusk. The wind met him like judgment. Cold, sharp, deserved. He mounted his horse and rode through town, past the chapel, the mercantile, the station where her story began. By the time he reached the boarding house, the lanterns had just been lit. He knocked once. Mrs. Finch opened the door and gave him a look that could curdle cream. "If you're the one she's waiting on, you best have more than an apology in your pocket." "I do," he said, then paused. I hope. Inside, Naomi stood with a thimble on her finger and a needle midair, her face unreadable. She didn't flinch, didn't fold, just looked at him like a woman who'd weathered worse than being left behind. I reckon I'm late, he said quietly. Naomi nodded once. 3 days late. Matthew took off his hat. I was scared. She arched a brow. Of me? No, ma'am, he said, voice low. Of what I wanted, and what I didn't think I deserved. The room was quiet. Naomi set the needle down and walked over, her hands steady as stone. If you're here for pity, you won't find it. If you're here to make things right, you better saddle up fast. I don't have time for men who walk away before the trail even starts. Matthew met her gaze. I didn't come to beg. I came to ask if you'd still ride with me. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Naomi said, I'll ride, but I don't ride behind. And that, friends, was the start of something neither of them saw coming. 2 days later, Naomi stood at the edge of Matthew Chandler's land, a wide hat shielding her eyes from the Wyoming sun. It wasn't the kind of beauty you found in paintings. No green fields, no gentle rivers, just hills rolled like knuckles, dry grass swaying like prayer flags, and wind that never stopped whispering. The house was plain, but solid, logs chinked tight, windows trimmed with care, a porch wide enough for sitting, a barn leaning slightly to the right, and fences stretching off into the horizon like stitched seams on a patchwork quilt. Naomi saw all that, and nodded once. This it? She asked. Matthew stood beside her, hat in hand. It ain't Chicago. No, she said. It's better. He blinked at that, surprised. Better. Back home, I was always looking over my shoulder. Here, I only need to look ahead. They stepped inside, and Naomi saw a house made by hands that hadn't known much company. 1 chair, 1 coat hook, 1 spoon too many, but that was likely just habit. The air smelled of dust, pine, and something unspoken. Matthew cleared his throat. Ain't much. Naomi looked at him. You asked for a partner, not a maid. A partner builds. She set her bundle down, pulled out her sewing kit, and started measuring the windows. He watched her, half afraid to move, like if he blinked she'd vanish again. That first night, they didn't speak much. She cooked beans with a scrap of ham he'd been saving. He chopped wood without needing to be asked. By the time the fire settled into coals, they sat across from one another. 2 souls, not yet sure how to touch, but already leaning the same direction. They didn't share a bed. That hadn't been asked, nor offered. Naomi took the cot near the window, and Matthew rolled out a blanket by the hearth. She didn't sleep easy, but she didn't toss either. Morning brought frost, breath clouds, and the smell of coffee strong enough to wake a ghost. Naomi found Matthew outside, hauling water. He looked up, his breath misting the cold. You gonna stay? He asked. She didn't answer right away. Walked to the edge of the porch, looked out over that bare country where cattle wandered and silence ruled. I will, she said, but I need one thing first. Matthew tensed. Name it. I want my name on that barn. He blinked. You want your name? She nodded. I didn't cross half the country to be a shadow. I want folks to know who helps run this place. Matthew stared at her a long moment. Then he smiled, slow and honest. Well now, he said, you best pick a hammer. Later that day, the sign went up. C and N Chandler Ranch, hand-carved by a man who'd never expected to love again, and a woman who refused to vanish. But peace don't stay long on the frontier. Just over the next ridge, trouble stirred, and it had Matthew's name carved in its sights. The days passed like steady hoofbeats, routine, quiet, and honest. Naomi worked the land with Matthew, her fingers calloused from hauling feed and stitching saddlebags. The two of them moved like clockwork, neither needing to say much to know what the other was about to do. It was a partnership born of sweat and silence, and something else beginning to stir, something neither dared name just yet. But the wind in Wyoming don't whisper for long. Sometimes it brings word from the past. That word came in the form of a rider. Late one afternoon, as the sun stretched long shadows across the canyon edge, Naomi spotted him first. A speck on the ridge, dust trailing like smoke behind a dark-coated horse. The figure didn't ride like a traveler or a preacher. He rode like a man who knew where he was going, and didn't care if you wanted him there or not. Matthew stood beside her as the rider approached. He didn't move, just pulled his hat low and let out a slow breath that sounded more like a warning. The rider stopped 10 feet out, dust swirling around his boots. "Been a while, Chandler," the man said. His voice was like dry gravel. "Didn't expect to find you with company." Naomi didn't flinch. She stepped forward, hands still dusty from fence work, her eyes locked on the stranger. "You bringing news or trouble?" The man grinned. "Guess that depends." Matthew finally spoke. "What do you want, Clay?" "Same as always," Clay drawled. "A reckoning." Naomi glanced at Matthew. His jaw was tight, hands curled into fists at his side. Clay dismounted slow, like he had all the time in the world. "You walked away from a deal, Chandler. Took what wasn't yours. And folks ain't forgotten." "That deal," Matthew said, voice low, "was with men who buried good folks to build their empire." Clay shrugged. "Still profitable. And still mine." Naomi stepped forward again. "This land's paid for. By his hands and mine." Clay's eyes flicked to her, lingered a second too long. "Ain't about land," he said. "It's about memory. And blood." Naomi stepped between them, her voice calm but cold. "You got a quarrel. You'll wait till you got cause." Clay chuckled. "You're a fire, miss. I see that." He turned, mounted back up, and tipped his hat. "I'll be back. Just thought I'd offer my welcome." He rode off, just as slow as he came, dust in his wake like the tail of a snake. Naomi watched till he was gone, then turned to Matthew. "What's he mean? Took what wasn't yours." Matthew didn't answer right away, just looked out toward the ridge, where Clay had vanished. "Back before I lost Helen, I rode with men who thought owning the land meant owning the people on it too. I walked away, but they never forgave that." Naomi crossed her arms. "He coming back?" "Oh, he'll come back," Matthew said. "And next time, he won't be alone." The sun dipped below the hills, and the air turned colder. Trouble had announced itself, and it wasn't done knocking. That night, the prairie was too quiet. The stars shone sharp and cold, hanging above the homestead like silent witnesses. Naomi moved through the cabin like a woman preparing for more than bedtime, checking the shutters, stacking wood near the door, tucking a kitchen knife beneath the corner of her bedroll. Matthew watched her from the porch, pipe unlit, hand resting near the rifle laid across his lap. "You think he'll come tonight?" she asked, voice low. Matthew didn't answer right away. Men like Clay don't wait long. They reckon delay shows weakness. Naomi nodded. "Good thing we're not weak." She stepped outside, the moonlight catching the silver threads in her hair wrap. The wind tugged at her shawl, but she didn't shiver. "Tell me," she said, "what did you do exactly?" Matthew exhaled slow. "Clay and I rode together back in Texas. Drove cattle north, helped settle lands. But the land they claimed wasn't theirs to claim. Belonged to a freedman's family near Abilene. Clay wanted to run him off. I said no. That night, I warned the family and got him out. When Clay found out, he made it clear I wasn't welcome." Naomi looked at him for a long time. "You saved lives." "Maybe," he said, "but it didn't bring peace." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his. "Maybe it's time to stop running." They didn't speak after that, just listened to the wind, the cattle stirring, the sound of fire crackling in the stove. Sleep came slow and shallow. Then, just past midnight, a sound split the night. A pop, like timber cracking, but sharper. Then another. Gunfire. Matthew was off the cot in an instant, rifle in hand, boots half-laced. Naomi didn't scream. She grabbed her coat, ducked low, and moved to the front window. 3 riders, lanterns swinging, shadows circling the barn. Matthew cursed under his breath. "They're after the herd." Naomi grabbed his arm. "No, they're after you." He nodded once, jaw set. "Stay here." "You forget who you married?" she snapped. "I've handled more than a needle and thread in my day." Together, they slipped out the back, cutting low through the tall grass. The barn loomed ahead, one wall glowing from a lantern tossed too carelessly. embers licking at the timber. Matthew lifted his rifle. One shot, clean, cold, final. A rider dropped. The other two scattered, one firing blindly, the other trying to wrangle a horse. Naomi darted toward the barn, snatched the lantern, and flung it into the trough. Flames hissed, steam rising in a ghostly plume. She didn't flinch, just turned and ducked as another bullet whistled past. Matthew fired again. Then silence. No more shots. Just the ragged breath of night and the scent of smoke on cold air. They waited. Then slowly, the moon revealed the last rider, Clay himself, crouched by the fence, bleeding from a graze on his leg. He looked up, saw Matthew and Naomi side by side, both steady as oak. He tried to stand. Matthew raised the rifle. "Don't," Naomi said firm. "Not unless you mean to bury him here." Clay's eyes narrowed. "You got what you want, Chandler, but you won't keep it." Matthew stepped forward. "You're right. I won't keep it. We will." Clay spat, then limped off into the dark, one hand on his thigh, the other clenched around his pride. Naomi turned to Matthew. "You all right?" He nodded. "Thanks to you." They stood together till the first light broke the edge of the hills. The barn still smoked. The cattle were spooked. But the homestead stood. Naomi looked out over the land and whispered, "We built this, and I'll be damned if anyone tears it down." The morning after the firefight, Naomi and Matthew moved like folks who'd lived through more than just gunfire. They worked the land without a word, hammering new planks into the barn wall and checking the herd for injury. Smoke still clung to the rafters like bad memories, but the fire hadn't taken much, just a few boards and the last trace of peace. Naomi patched her shawl with her own thread, then set to cooking cornbread thick, with lard and salt. Matthew cleaned his rifle slow, each stroke deliberate. By the time dusk rolled in, they sat on the porch steps, elbows brushing, breath mingling with the cool air. Matthew spoke first. "I've been thinking on what you said, about your name on the barn, on this life." Naomi looked at him sideways. "And I reckon it ain't just your name ought to be there. It's your hand, your grit, your fire." Naomi gave him a small smile. "Then I hope you know this place. It's mine now, too. You walk away, I stay." He nodded once. "I won't be walking." They sat there a while longer till the sound of hooves reached him, steady and slow, not sneaky. Matthew stood, rifle in hand but not raised. Out of the dust came a wagon, old weather-beaten, hitched to a single-tired mule. At the reins sat a boy, maybe 12, eyes too sharp for his years. In the back, bundled beneath quilts, lay a woman, barely moving. The boy halted the wagon. "You Chandler?" Matthew stepped forward. "I am. She's sick. Been heading west for weeks. Preacher and Laramie said you'd help." Naomi was already moving, her apron flapping like a banner. "Bring her in," she said. "I've got water boiling." They lifted the woman, her skin pale and breath shallow. Naomi worked fast, compresses, broth, whispered prayers from a book, so worn it barely held its stitching. That night, Naomi didn't sleep. She nursed the stranger like she'd known her all her life. The boy sat on the porch, watching Matthew repair the broken wagon wheel by moonlight. "You married?" the boy asked. Matthew glanced toward the cabin window, where Naomi's shadow moved behind the curtain. "I am now," he said. By dawn, the woman's fever broke. Naomi brought her outside wrapped in a shawl and helped her sit in the rocker, warm broth in hand. "You saved her," the boy whispered. Naomi knelt beside him. "No, son, we did." They stayed a few days, long enough for the woman to speak, for the boy to laugh, for Matthew and Naomi to realize they'd crossed a line deeper than vows. They were no longer strangers making a life. They were a home others could find shelter in. Before they left, the boy handed Naomi a small, carved figure of a bird. "She made this," he said. "Said it's to remember the sky. For you." Naomi held the bird in her palm, eyes soft. After they left, Matthew fixed a nail above the hearth and hung the little carving right where the firelight could catch its wings. "Looks like we're more than just a ranch now," he said. Naomi nodded. "We're a refuge." But just as they found peace again, a telegram arrived, carried by a dust-choked rider with a black coat and a sealed envelope. Matthew opened it with a knife. He read the words. Then his face turned to stone. Naomi stood. "What is it?" He handed her the telegram. 3 lines. Clay dead. Killed on trail to Cheyenne. Not alone. Naomi read it twice. And whispered. Then the real storm's still coming. The telegram burned in Naomi's hand long after the words had settled. Clay was dead, but he hadn't died quiet. And he hadn't died alone. Matthew stood at the edge of the porch, his eyes fixed on the distant ridge. Clay was many things, but he wasn't the head of the snake. Naomi folded the telegram and tucked it into her apron. "Then who is?" Matthew's jaw tightened. "His brother, Ezra. Meaner, smarter, and backed by men with money and guns." They spent the next day reinforcing the fences, stacking supplies in the root cellar, and cleaning every firearm on the ranch. Naomi wrote letters, one to the sheriff in Casper, another to a friend who ran a church with a bell tower and an old Remington behind the altar. When she finished, she took down her sewing kit, not for curtains this time, but for oilcloth wraps and new stitching on a rifle sling. Matthew came in as she worked, brow lined with fatigue. "You always this calm before a fight." Naomi looked up. "I was raised by a mother who hid runaway folks under our floorboards in Chicago. I was calm then. I'm calm now." That night, sleep didn't come easy. Matthew lay beside her on the floor. Neither of them used to bed anymore, not since the storm had started brewing. He reached over, found her hand in the dark, and held it like a man clutching a compass. "You ever think," he said, "maybe we weren't meant to find each other?" Naomi turned to face him. "No, I think maybe we were the only ones meant to survive long enough to do this right." She leaned over and kissed his forehead. They didn't speak again. Not till morning. The first sign came at sunrise, dust on the horizon, low and fast. Not riders yet, but scouts. Ezra's men. Naomi saddled the horses, tied bundles to the rear, and laid out a map on the kitchen table. "If we ride south," she said, "we can draw him away from the homestead. Let him through the canyon. Narrow trails. 1-on-1 odds." Matthew shook his head. "Too risky." "I'm not asking," Naomi said. "I'm riding either way. You coming?" He stared at her, then nodded once. "Always." They rode hard, Naomi on her chestnut mare, Matthew on his old gray. The wind whipped past, and the canyon walls rose like stone teeth on either side. By midday, they were in the thick of it. That's when the bullets started. Not wildfire, trained, practiced. Ezra's men knew what they were doing. Matthew turned in the saddle, rifle to his shoulder. Naomi kept her mare low, weaving between stone outcroppings, until she spotted a figure on the ledge. Ezra himself, long coat snapping in the wind, rifle in hand. Naomi didn't wait. She drew her pistol, aimed, and fired once, high. Just enough to spook his horse. The beast reared, Ezra tumbled, and his shot went wild, ricocheting off stone. Below, Matthew's rifle barked, twice, clean and sure. 2 riders fell. Ezra scrambled to his feet, blood at his temple, and vanished behind a rock face. The rest scattered. It wasn't a victory. Not yet, but it was enough. Matthew galloped up beside Naomi, dust in his beard and smoke in his eyes. "You all right?" She wiped her brow. "I'm better than all right. We just made him bleed." They didn't chase. They didn't need to. By nightfall, the canyon was quiet again, and the road home lay open. Naomi looked at the stars above and whispered, "Lem come. This place is worth fighting for." The ride home was quiet, the kind that ain't empty, but full of reckonings. Naomi and Matthew reached the homestead just past dusk, the porch lantern swinging gentle in the breeze. The barn door hung open from where they'd left it in haste, and the chickens were still rattled, feathers scattered like ghosts of the fight they'd outrun. But the house stood, whole, waiting. They unsaddled the horses in silence, led em to the trough, and let the cold Wyoming air wrap round their tired shoulders. Inside, Naomi stirred a pot of beans, her hands moving out of memory more than hunger. Matthew dropped into a chair, his body sore from the ride, his mind heavier than the day's weight. "Reckon Ezra'll come again?" she asked. He nodded. "He's got pride. He'll want to bury this himself." Naomi stirred the pot slow. Then let him come. We'll plant his name like we plant onions, deep and where it don't grow. Matthew chuckled, but there wasn't much joy in it. That night, she found him out on the porch, his coat wrapped tight, the rifle laid across his knees. He was staring at the hills, the same ones that once seemed to stretch forever. Naomi sat beside him, pulled her shawl close. You ain't a ghost, Matthew. I feel like one. Ghosts don't bleed, she said, and they sure as in don't love. He turned to her then, eyes soft in the lantern light. You think I love you. I know you do, she said, calm and clear. Same way I love this land and the fight we earned together. He reached into his coat and pulled something from his pocket, a ring. Simple silver, with a scratch down one side like a scar. I traded a saddle for it, he said. A long time ago. Never gave it to Helen. I didn't know why. I do now. Naomi stared at it, the firelight flickering in her eyes. You sure? He nodded. Ain't never been surer of anything. She took the ring, turned it once in her fingers, then slid it on. Good, she said. Now we bury the past. They rose before dawn and rode to the ridge. There, beneath a twisted pine, Matthew dug a hole with bare hands. Naomi pulled the telegram from her apron and tore it in two. They buried it together, paper and past alike, then stood over the fresh earth. No more ghosts, Naomi whispered. From that day on, the homestead changed. Word got out about what had happened in the canyon. The telegram, the standoff, the woman who didn't blink, and the man who finally stood tall. Folks started calling at the Bell-Chandler Ranch. No one asked which name came first. Children came to help mend the fences. A young widow brought seeds for the garden. Old Mrs. Finch from the boarding house sent a box of books, tied with blue string. And Naomi? She started teaching little things. Reading, mending, tending, but mostly how to stay, even when the world wanted you gone. The past didn't vanish, but it settled, became a story with an ending, or maybe a beginning. Spring rolled in slow, like a shy guest knocking gentle on the door. Snow gave way to grass, and the hard edges of winter softened into something kinder. Naomi stood at the fence line, her hands wrapped around a fresh post, eyes on the horizon. Calves danced in the pasture, their tails flicking like flags. The air smelled of soil and pine and the faintest promise of rain. Inside the house, the table was set for company. Matthew was smoothing his hair in the mirror, an act so rare, Naomi nearly laughed when she caught him doing it. He shrugged when she raised a brow. Reckon if folks are going to call this a proper ranch, I ought to look the part. She stepped close, brushed the collar of his shirt straight. You look like a man who kept his word. That's enough. The guests came before noon. Mrs. Finch with her biscuits, the widow from the ridge with green onions tied in twine, the preacher who blessed the porch and stayed for pie, and others, cowhands, schoolgirls, even a few ranchers who once wouldn't meet Naomi's eyes. But today, they shook her hand like she'd been born here. That evening, the gathering moved to the barn. Naomi stood beneath the sign she'd carved with her own knife, Bell-Chandler Ranch, and cleared her throat. I came out here, she said, with nothing but a letter and a name. No money, no promise, just the hope that a man meant what he wrote. She looked at Matthew, then at the crowd. Well, he did, and I kept my end too. This land, this home, it wasn't given. We built it, with calluses and kindness, and more than a few bruises. Folks nodded, murmured, clapped slow and honest. That night, Naomi and Matthew sat on the porch, a quiet lull settling over the homestead. The stars came out in clusters, bright and sure. Matthew leaned back in his chair. You ever miss the city? Naomi shook her head. City never knew what to do with me. He smiled. And I do. She turned to him, her voice soft. You let me be. That's more than most. They sat there long after the lanterns had gone out, the only light left in the sky. Naomi's hand found his. They didn't speak of the past, nor the danger they'd passed through. That was behind them now, buried under pine, scattered in the dust of the canyon, and faded into the folds of a telegram long forgotten. What remained was this place, this home, and the kind of love you build with grit, not flowers.